Welcome to the Infra Insider podcast from InfraBe, a leader in renewable energy and infrastructure executive search. Join us as we dive into insightful conversations with industry leaders, pioneers and visionaries shaping the future of infrastructure and renewable energy. Discover the latest trends and innovations and challenges driving the transition towards a greener and more resilient future. Please remember to like and subscribe. Welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. This is actually episode 3. And today we're going to be looking at a sector that's very close to my heart. And I'll probably talk about that a little bit later on. But the sector is anaerobic digestion. A very brief introduction. Peter Sharpe is the CEO of a business called Biocapital. Biocapital are wholly owned by the large infrastructure fund Equitix and a private equity firm called Helios based in Israel. And they came together in 2018 with a view to build and operate a large portfolio of anaerobic digestion assets. I had the privilege of working with Peter around about 2021, and I say this is a privilege because me and Peter, we go back a long way.
We do.
We go back a long way, and I actually think my first cold call as a young recruiter was to you, Peter, and you were just so lovely to me, and I genuinely mean that. So you hold a special place in my heart, and I remember back in my mind. When I got the mandate to find a CEO for Biocapital, and I remember it was around COVID time, 2021, and I remember being sat on holiday, work-life balance and all, but I remember sat on holiday having a conversation with you, and I just knew you were the right man for the role. Peter is an incredible leader of people. You've done it for years, but look, without further ado, Peter, I've introed you as much as I could, but please tell us about yourself and your career.
Daniel, I mean, what can I say? It's a pleasure to chat to you, and thank you for those words. It's the first time you've told me that I was your first cold call all those years ago.
Might have been, yeah.
So thank you for sharing that. Well, we haven't got that long to go through my career, so because as you can probably see, I'm in the late autumn, early winter of my career. So all I'd say is I've had a career you could categorise of two broadly equal halves now. An early career of just over 20 years as an officer in the British Army, which was a very varied career. And then I decided for various reasons that there was the right time to make a change. And then I moved into the private sector. And since then, I've been lucky enough to hold a variety of roles. But a lot of them, the linking part has been very commercial, but increasingly involved in what I'd call the environmental sector in the broadest terms, and then focusing more and more latterly on renewable energy. That's sort of a brief summary of my career.
So that's really interesting because you've gone from environmental and maybe even waste management, and now it's become renewable energy. So let's head straight into what actually is anaerobic digestion.
It can be described technically in many ways, but in essence, it's taking a biogenic feedstock, whether that be food waste, which the majority of the Biocapital business is based on, animal wastes or farm wastes, or energy crops, digesting that, as everyone says, pretty much like a stomach for a period of time, and then you get a number of products and co-products off that, and increasingly those co-products are becoming very vital. I'm sure we'll touch on that. And you in essence, you get a biogas off that, which you can use to generate renewable electricity. You can purify that biogas to produce biomethane for injection into the grid. to replace fossil fuel gas, or as a vehicle fuel to replace diesel. And you get what I prefer to call a biofertilizer, which you can return to the land to displace chemical fertilizers. And also, and increasingly, the capture of biogenic CO2 as well is what you get. So it fits really, really nicely into the circular economy.
There's a lot of bioproducts there, and I think that's some of what I want to touch on.
Yeah.
I suppose I knew anaerobic digestion, and the market knew anaerobic digestion probably going back 7 or 8 years ago, when there was this flurry of tariffs, wasn't there? And there was that you could probably name about 10 companies at the time that were building these small scale AD plants, that ultimately found it difficult to work. In terms of biocapital coming into the marketplace, I'm assuming there is a big portfolio of these types of assets. So I suppose it'd be interesting to understand what your strategy is when you come to invest. You know, what boxes need to be ticked from that asset class.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, Daniel, there's lots of funds and companies that are interested in acquiring these assets, all good companies and good funds. But we in Biocapital tend to go probably for a particular sort of asset. We prefer larger assets because we believe that is what gives the best commercial position and makes the plant more sustainable. So we like a large plant, and we like a plant that we can invest into and grow, whether that's growing in optimizing the performance, growing in terms of physically adding capacity, or improving the co-products, moving it from renewable electricity into biomethane. So we like a plant we can further invest in. And it also has to sort of sit with the geography that we are looking for in relation to our other portfolio of plants. But in sort of very straightforward terms, we like well-performing plants to a degree, and large plants that we can invest in. I think because, and there are a few companies like us, because we own and operate, we do feel we have the capability to take plants that are maybe not performing at the optimum level, and over a period of time bring those up to optimum performance.
Interesting. I read that Biocapital is now the largest producer of biogas in the UK. I'm assuming that was one of your targets. What is your goal, let's say, over the next 24 months?
I mean, I think pick your metric and you choose your metric to say which you're largest in, and the data is very incomplete. I mean, what I would say is I think within we're coming up to our 5th anniversary, we're certainly one of the 3 largest AD companies outside the regulated water companies,
and probably the youngest, which is an interesting statistic, isn't it?
Yes, we are quite young, quite vibrant, and maybe come about it with a slightly different angle. I think over the next 2 years, what we are seeking to do, well, I mean, when I arrived in the company in 2021, one of the first things I did was agree a 5-year business strategy, and there's nothing secret about it. And in that 5-year strategy, we have 3 enduring goals, 3 enduring business objectives, which are asset optimization, profitable growth, and responsible and transparent. So in asset optimization, we look to make the most of what we've got. So we make our plants as optimized as we can in terms of outputs, in revenues, reducing costs, but very critically in that is the people. AD, I would say, having worked in EFW before, and having a long time ago having done a chemistry degree, I always say EFW burning stuff is physics. AD is biology. It's an art, and you do need really skilled operators to make these plants sing. So you have to make sure you recruit and retain and look after your staff as a key part of optimizing the assets. Profitable growth, as somebody I worked for a long time ago told me, very wise words. He said, if there's one thing worse than losing a tender or a potential acquisition, it's winning an unprofitable one. So we're very much
wise words.
Yes, words that have stood me in good stead. We will continue to look to expand, both in terms of geography, but also looking increasingly at expanding what I would call up and down the value chain of AD. Maybe looking at our position through either acquisition or relationships or joint venture with collection, and looking then down also in the uses of biomethane, partnering people in refueling or using that biomethane as part of their company's green journey as well. So that would be I will concentrate on that one because on the responsible and transparent, because I think that is an area that the AD sector can let itself down on sometimes. And the last couple of years we have had a bit of attention from the health and safety executive. It's really important that we are responsible financially, but responsible in terms of health and safety, well-being, and in the environment as well. It's really important.
So we started to touch upon, I think, a byproduct of anaerobic digestion. We're starting to talk about biomethane. I think one of the things that was really interesting to talk to you about today is what the byproducts are from the anaerobic digestion process, because I'm assuming that the number of byproducts that there are ultimately the thing that's probably attracting more attention. And when we're talking about more attention, we're talking about greater amount of investment, funds coming to the market, new investors, both UK, Europe, and global. So, Peter, what are the byproducts of anaerobic digestion?
Well, I mean, the key ones are, as you get biogas, which you can turn, as we discussed, into electricity, or you can purify and produce biomethane and biogenic CO2. We'll probably come back to that, and then we'll talk about biofertilizer. The biomethane is really important. The UK over the last 10 years or so has done very well in decarbonising much of its economy. It's done really well. But there's a number of areas that are really difficult. Heavy vehicle fuel, fuel for HGVs, and gas for heating and industrial use of gas. And I think the long-term energy strategy pins a lot of hope on hydrogen, but it would need to be green hydrogen, and that may be a few years away. But biomethane, it represents an excellent opportunity for decarbonising the heavy vehicle fleet, but also the gas network. There's really good opportunities there for making significant steps in decarbonising two areas of the UK economy that have proved to be very difficult to do over the past decade or so. So I think biomethane offers a real prospect of whether it's a 10 or 15 year interim until hydrogen. But of course, biogas can be used to split eventually into hydrogen later on, so it doesn't become a redundant source. So I think biomethane is becoming increasingly important. Biogenic CO2 that comes off as part of the purification program, again, is increasingly important. We use a lot of CO2. It's been a real issue for the past couple of years, as I'm sure you know, in UK, with the cost of energy forcing fertilizer producers out, which produces a lot of CO2. So there's been pressure on the supply. And biogenic CO2 offers a route for securing CO2 supply and being partnering with another company to be part of their green solution. But also, I think increasingly, and one of my colleagues told me a year or so ago that within 10 years, the biofertilizer would be the most valuable thing we produce. The biomethane and the CO2 would be a the minor products, and the biofertilizer would be the
Okay.
most important.
That's
And
interesting.
I'm not sure I agreed with him, but I think there is increasing value in that. But I think that the sector has work to do to realise that value.
What's their perspective? Why do they think that the biofertilizer is going to be, you know, the most sought after byproduct?
I think the position that my colleague was coming from is that chemical fertilizers that farms rely upon heavily, they're becoming increasingly expensive in terms of price, cost, but they're very expensive in terms of CO2 and carbon costs. And farms have targets for carbon reduction, like all businesses and individuals do. And the view is that if we can just sort of work a little harder on what we produce as a sector, this will be potentially offer significant alternative to chemical fertilizers, which are just not sustainable in terms of carbon cost and physical cost.
Yeah.
So, but I think there's work to do. As I said, I'm not sure I entirely agreed with him at the time, but I did leave him with that challenge to deliver that.
So look, so in terms of anaerobic digestion, you've got these plants that are producing all of these byproducts that obviously can create revenue, but ultimately that, you know, one of the main things is they're also producing energy, selling it back to the grid. You know, it's a wonderful system.
Yes.
It feels like the market is mainly based around others acquiring assets.
Yes.
Is there a case in the future for people to be developing these plants, to be building these plants?
Of course, and you know, I think greenfield development depends heavily on the environment and the conditions that are being set by government and regulation. And I think that's we can't get away from that. And you know, we've been waiting for a while now for the government to announce where England is going on requiring local authorities to separately collect food waste, and also England are now discussing the ban of biodegradable material from landfill, all of which will generate through regulation more food waste. The development, I think, in the recent years of new AD plants, greenfield AD plants, have very much relied on a support scheme set up by the government, as you referred to, RHIs, FITs, ROCs. Now the green gas support scheme, which has got a pretty tight timetable for being having your plants ready. So I think there's much discussion going on with government about extending that timetable to allow more plants to be developed, getting that regulatory inviting environment right, getting the support scheme right. But I think we are, in the next few years, approaching a point where you could consider, with secure feedstock supply, you could build a plant that maybe overly didn't require government support. And that's the position that you can't build an industry on government support. That helps you get established as a sector.
And so that obviously is what accelerated the space initially, which was probably maybe too fast, some critics would say, because then we ended up with lots of plants that didn't necessarily work. We won't go into the controversy around that one. No. But no, it's really, really interesting to see this evolution. And of course, you know, what we've discussed today about all of these new byproducts, these are relatively, well, no, they're not new things, they've always existed. Do you feel that maybe the market's taken a step back and realised that things can be monetized, or do you think that it's investors looking at it and kind of being able to see and feel the monetization?
I think it's easy to look at funds and say all they're interested is monetizing in returns, and yes, clearly that's an important thing. I think it's being a little unfair. increasingly the funds really do care about things associated with ESG, and they do. And in the broadest sense, ESG, not just the carbon and the environmental, but the social. How are you treating your colleagues? How are you treating your communities? Is increasingly important. But I think if we can get the government to set the right economy, I think this can thrive. And leveling the playing fields on who has, carbon trading, the cost of carbon. If you start having a genuine cost of carbon in economic calculations, then AD, like other technologies, suddenly becomes, well, we can play here without significant support. So I think the government does clearly have a role in setting the environment, be that in terms of collection about regulation or whatever, carbon trading. And then I think the market will then generally deliver if those conditions are set and those conditions are stable. And going back, I think one of the things which has lasted many years now, which was done, was the landfill tax escalator in terms of energy from waste. The government of the day set a policy. It said this is what the landfill tax is going to be. It's going to escalate at this rate. And it did. And that sort of set the environment that investment decisions were made. And I think in AD, we are not saying it's a landfill tax, but there needs to be something that sets that stable environment that attracts money in. But unfortunately, to sort of pick up, I think the introduction of the electricity generator levy has taken a significant step backwards in setting that positive environment for investment. I think it has.
What regulation reforms do you think the AD market needs?
I think the government needs to come out with a clear statement on the source segregation in England. And that announcement needs to be made sooner rather than later. We've been waiting for it a long time. The position on biodegradable into landfill needs to be settled. I think these are all short-term measures. The discussions around the extension of accreditation for the Green Gas Support Scheme needs to be settled. I think we need to be clear about carbon trading. What is that carbon trading? What are the targets being set? And be stable. I mean, there's a clear decision was taken by government that doesn't seem connected to us, but is electric vehicles, no new combustion vehicles to be sold after 2030. We've been having conversations with car charging companies about supplying renewable electricity. Now the government seems to be going a little bit of, well, maybe we don't mean 2030, and that just removes confidence from the market. So I think set the environment, stick to it. And I think we also need to start before too long having a discussion about what you might be called in sort of wind turbine terms, repowering of AD plants that were set up under the original schemes that that were set up. Now, some of those plants have, as you've alluded to, have not performed well, but some of them have the potential to do so. And do we really want to lose all that treatment and generating capacity? So I think we need a proper dialogue there with government about repowering of those plants.
And touching on the anaerobic digestion of the past, it had that tarnished reputation of a technology that didn't necessarily work. I'm not, don't understand the full details of it, but it was about the right kind of feedstock. But it seems like there's a lot more confidence now in this technology, and I think we've seen it over the last sort of 18 months, really, with the amount of investment in the space. So I think that's great to see. I think it's always been an amazing technology. And why build large scale incinerators when you can build AD plants, which is far, far greater for the circular economy, like you said.
Absolutely. And I've worked in the EFW sector, and burning food wastes, well, it's not good for anybody. So let's do that and use it in a really more positive way. And to pick up your point, I think, you know, there are now in UK a number of really good, really capable operators. I mean, yes, Bycapital is one of them, but we're not the sole one. And you know, I'd be really encouraged, you know, major food waste producers, manufacturers, and local authorities, you know, be really careful who you give this resource to. Ask the questions, and make sure that the company that you are contracting with is sort of meeting all those requirements and doing all they can do in terms of duty of care and carbon reduction in that waste. And I think some local authorities could scratch under the surface a little more as to who are you partnering with for this.
You know, Bycapital clearly have, you know, very, very high integrity. You know, you can see that, and I think that's really nice thing just generally about the renewables market. I wanted to touch on a couple more things because I know that you're incredibly busy. I really appreciate the time that you've given already. The one thing that I wanted to understand was, firstly, is there a market outside of the UK? You know, do you see any activity as much as there is in the UK outside of here?
Of course, in mainland Europe, there's a lot of activity, and as you all know, a lot of activity, and certainly the two owners of Bycapital both have AD investments on mainland Europe. So yes, I see it as a clearly it's a European market for biomethane and AD, and some countries in Europe have a more positive environment for it than UK, and some not as good and development. In terms of Bycapital, I'm always sort of keeping an eye across the channel and maybe over into North America, but I think for the moment there's a lot for Bycapital to do in UK, but I certainly think for Europe there's a lot of activity, as you know.
And I'm assuming you know the market incredibly well, but feedstock always seems to be high on everyone's agenda in the world of anaerobic digestion.
Yes.
Who should be reaching out to you? What kind of industries would Bycapital love to hear from a feedstock perspective?
Oh, from a feedstock perspective, we'd love to hear from any sort of large waste food business, food manufacturer or hospitality chain, who, in two ways. One, wants to get better value for their food waste and putting it into their black bin, and paying for it to go to the local energy and waste plant. But also those companies who really want to partner with us long term to reduce their carbon footprint.
It's a no-brainer, really, isn't it?
To reduce it, so it's commercially good, reduces the carbon footprint, and but also even better, it's companies we can then complete the circular economy with and give them something back. Can we give them biomethane as a vehicle fuel? If you're an agriculture base, can we give biofertilizer to your farmers that produce your food? Do you use CO2? And then you can really complete this really lovely circular economy picture. Yes, and it's a great narrative and it's great for carbon, but it's also really good for business as well. You know, putting your food waste in the black bin, you know, it's costing you money. So we'd be grateful to talk to anybody. And you know, and even if Bycapital on the right solution, happy to signpost them to other sort of colleagues in the sector if we haven't quite got the right solution in that geography. So love to hear from them, love to hear from local authorities. And again, I think the future here is in partnering, and for us, Bycapital, producing a really excellent client service, whether that's in collecting the food waste and producing key KPIs back or other products back, or if it's biofertilizer, a real, not just here's your digestate, but a real service. You know, becoming a service through this, as I've said, going up and down through the value chain a little bit to deliver that really good service.
I think it solves problems on so many different levels, and
Yeah.
I always love your enthusiasm, and I think it's great to get just that greater perspective from one of the industry leaders in the space. And yeah, anaerobic digestion, I think has got some incredible mileage, and I feel like it's only just getting started. So I think we're going to watch the sector and space with great interest. But you know, I've loved speaking to you today, and because we never actually have these conversations whereby we actually go into greater detail, and we're normally talking about, you know, staffing, and it's interesting what you just said about, you know, the way you approach business. It's not just about the money, it's about the value, and that's how you build, and that's how you built your team. Yeah, and that's how you built the team. That's how you built the business. And thankfully, we put you into BioCapital, and you make us look really good on a daily basis. So
I'm not sure they always say that. But what I will do, and you can cut this off, and I one of the questions you sent me was, how did I get into the sector? And
yes,
and you shared this one. I will share. Sorry, but you know, I've been thinking about reusing of food since my earliest days, and many years ago, when I was an undergraduate in London, I used to work. A few years ago, I used to work in a well-known fast food chain in Shepherd's Bush. Bush, and this was the time when these places used to close at 10:30 or 11, not 24 hours. You know, I'm that old, and it was incredibly clean. The manager was incredibly enthusiastic, and I always used to get the late shifts because I was at university or doing something else. And at the end of the evening, there was the food that used just to be thrown away, And Shepherd's Bush, I mean, was an area for homeless people sleeping. So I started just slipping a few boxes in my arms as I left, and giving them out to the naivety of youth, because it started. Because one evening there was sort of about 30 or 40 people outside the back door of this restaurant looking for food, and the manager.
Well, they'd heard about you.
Well, exactly. The word gets around. The manager wanted to know who was responsible for this, and I was. I think the technical term then was grassed up by one of my colleagues, and I was invited to never return to the restaurant again, because I had broken the regulations about food hygiene. And I can understand that now, because what I could have been doing was dangerous. But it did show at an early stage, you've got to minimise. Yes, we are the end of the food waste chain, but minimise it first. And lots of good sort of hospitality chains now are doing the best they can in supermarkets to always try and move up that chain. And food you're not using, if it can be usably given to charities or people who need it, food banks, then do that. And we're at the end of that chain.
I think it says a lot about you. You were adding value back in, and this is, you know, when a lot of my clients who are involved in renewable energy, you know, it's not so much focused on the profits and the money. You know, they're clearly on the journey to add value, to clean the economy. You know, there's more to it than that.
I do believe in it. I do believe that. So no, but Daniel, thank you. It's been a pleasure having a longer chat with you for a change.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. And I think there's definitely another conversation for another time.
Probably one of my colleagues would be better placed. But Daniel, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Peter.
All right,
take care.
Bye.